Hello and welcome to Maths Chat, brought to you today by our good friends at TextHelp. I am Patrick McGrath and I am Education Technology Strategist here at TextHelp. And normally it is my job to do as much of the talking on these sessions as possible when we do broadcasts. But it is my very great privilege today to be able to very simply chair and host today's discussion, because today we're going to be hosting a panel discussion, and we have assembled what can only be described as the great and the good of maths practitioners from across the UK. We have 4 fantastic panel members, which I'll introduce to you in just a second, that are going to take part in what I hope is a very meaningful conversation about how maths looks in terms of the shape of education moving forward to next year. We, of course, recognize that the last few months have been a challenge for all of us. Practice has changed. How we interact with our students has changed, and some of our teaching approaches has had to change accordingly. So we will take a short time just at the start of the panel session today and reflect just on the challenges that we may have seen over the past 3 or so months of lockdown here. But we want to really make today about looking forward, about what the shape of perhaps the next academic year looks like, where technology fits, where CPD fits, where policy fits, and really importantly and centrally, where does pedagogy and practice fit, and where and how does it change as we move forward? So we know we've had change these last 3 months, but we know that as educators, we've always embraced change and we've always done the very best for our students and their understanding, in this case, of maths content. So as I said at the outset, we have literally the Avengers of maths with us today, and I'm going to introduce these just one by one and bring them on screen. So the first guest panelist today is Dr. Ciaran McIvor. Hello, Ciaran. How are you today?
Hello, Patrick. All good today.
Good. So Ciaran is a practitioner. He has been a maths teacher for nearly now 10 years, Ciaran, in St Malachy's College in Belfast. So we're going to lean on his expertise throughout today in terms of how he's found the interaction with students and how he's approached the teaching of maths. And I should have said, guys, I don't have time today to go through everybody's bio. If I did, it would fill up the entire hour that we had. So we'll tease bios through as we go. So next on our list today is Atul Rana. Atul, I've known for a few years now. Atul, you are definitely that little bit different than most of our maths practitioners in that you have actually been teaching online now for almost 10 years or so. Am I about right on that?
Yeah, I started 8 years ago, and 4 of those have been completely 100% online. Yeah.
So not many changes for lockdown in the 3 months then for you, Atul, but hopefully we'll explore those a little bit better. We've then got the legendary Mark McCourt, CEO of Salle Ed. Mark, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Patrick.
And as we were talking just before the recording today, I was talking to Mark just about how things were busy. And I think we both testified to the fact that we're almost busier now than we ever have been in terms of the practice and the methodology and the tools and the systems we have to put in place to support our educators out there. So Mark, thank you for joining us. And then last and definitely not least, we have Thomas Packer. Now, when I read Thomas's bio just before today, Thomas, you've been in education now for 35 years, I think. You don't look it. I have to say that right now, but welcome today. And you're currently leading the charge on CPD and staff development, and you're part of the Dragonfly team. Is that right?
That's it. Yep.
Perfect. Okay. Listen, thank you guys. We've got about 50 minutes or so of duration today, and hopefully we'll get through as many of the questions as we can. And I said at the outset that it would be useful to start being reflective and start to look at perhaps the challenges. And maybe Atul, actually, I'll start with you because I alluded to the fact that you've been online for some time now. But what do you see over the past sort of 3 months and how things have shifted? What do you see have been the main challenges, either for yourself or for maths teaching in general out there with lockdown?
Yeah, I mean, as an online tutor, I am in constant conversations with a lot of parents, and perhaps like the main thing is that lockdown has just created this stress with parents who are trying to work and have their children at home. So just providing children a space where they can learn, and if their schools are doing any sort of live teaching. So yeah, it's just that whole provision of the space. Actually, that's what I'm hearing from parents and from other teacher and tutor colleagues as well. because I tutor, and many of my tutor colleagues were just teaching in person, so they've tried to essentially save their businesses. So they've had to learn online tutoring very, very quickly, and it's been chaotic, to say the very least. Yeah.
And how much is the sort of the lack of structure sort of weighted on maths teaching? Is that lack of structure that students have had been a hindrance or almost a help, or does it depend on the student?
I'm getting all sorts of extremes. I mean, from some parents just saying my teenager is sleeping until 1 o'clock, so I can barely get them up to do anything, to some very diligent ones who are still feel like the intensity is even more than they had it when they were at school, because they're turning up to all the sessions, and a lot of students have had to also learn how to be taught online, and that itself is training for them as well. So yeah, it's like the whole range, really.
Ciaran, maybe just to bring you into that as an experienced maths teacher, still obviously practicing there. What have been the challenges you have seen? Do they reflect what Atul's seen there in terms of parental engagement? Is structure been a challenge there?
For the vast majority of pupils, it's maybe taken at the start of lockdown, there were a lot of challenges there, but the vast majority of pupils have actually, at this stage of lockdown, for me, achieved some sort of routine. Okay. And now the challenges for me as a teacher, and I know a lot of my teaching colleagues at the minute, would be in how we actually teach. So, for example, I mean, the big thing is assessment of learning.
Yeah.
How do we actually know that the pupils are learning? That was the big thing. How do we actually give them grades and so on, which is a massive thing. The other thing, as a maths teacher, one of my greatest tools in the classroom would be effective questioning, and that relies obviously on a group discussion. It relies on teasing out certain aspects of the maths teaching from pupils, and that's a massive challenge for me now online, because we've lost that forum almost of being in the classroom. So it's difficult for me. Teaching has gone more down the line of instruction. This is how you do it, and so it's more difficult to have those meaningful discussions with pupils. That's a massive thing for me.
Sorry, Ciaran, go ahead.
The other thing I would have relied on quite a bit in class, certainly with the younger pupils, would have been small group work. Working together to try and figure out a problem, to try and solve a particular problem, and that aspect of the maths teaching has certainly been lost over the last couple of months. And it's a very important aspect for me, because it allows pupils to kind of make solve meaningful problems using the maths that they've already been taught. The biggest thing though for me would be disaffected pupils. I mean, not all pupils have engaged with the process, as Atul mentioned there. Some pupils have been disaffected, and as a teacher, I have done my best to get in touch with parents, to get in touch with pupils. But unfortunately, some of our pupils are just from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and there's not the support at home there for those particular children. And some of them, unfortunately, and a small amount, but it's still, it's still a significant amount, have not been engaged in, unfortunately, in the work, no matter what type of support structures we've tried to put in place with them. And that's worrying for me. So the vast amount of pupils are excellent for me and have done really well, but there is a significant small number there who are losing out, and that's only going to get worse as time goes on.
Ciaran, it's a lack of face time. Mark, have you seen that? You're obviously in touch with, like Thomas there, with a huge network of maths educators. Is it you boil it down to something as simple as the lack of face time that has had the biggest direct impact, or is there more than that underlying those challenges?
It's very hard to say the kind of where we are now, what the challenges are at the moment. I think the main thing I would say is it's extraordinarily diverse. So, we work with thousands of schools. There are schools in our network where lessons are simply continuing as normal, and children are attending synchronous lessons just as the timetable would say and carrying on regardless. There are other schools where there's no provision whatsoever. So there's quite a lot of schools that have been told, actually, we're not even going to engage in any of this provision. And then the difference between schools that already had systems in place to schools that had to react quickly is enormous. So we're seeing, for example, schools that have been with us for years who are into a routine of the whole thing is delivered in a platform and you can access it at home and there's a coherent curriculum. That's a very smooth transition. But then lots of schools have had to react very, very quickly. And unfortunately, lots of schools, understandably, have just grabbed whatever they can grab without thinking, how does this interlock with our curriculum? Is this a coherent journey through the learning that we had planned? So there's quite a lot of ad hoc lessons happening at the moment that don't fit into a sequence of curriculum. And of course, that curriculum coherence is super important. As Ciaran's talking about, the responsiveness of the teaching, super important. The collaboration of pupils. And of course, that's an interesting thing that young people are very used to collaborating online to do all sorts of different things. And sometimes what I see is us underestimating what they can do, pupils. And then there are massive differences at age groups as well. We have to bear in mind, children have been away, missed 7 weeks school. Well, I had 3 months off school when I was a child, and it didn't do me any harm at all. But the reason it didn't do any harm is because I had very knowledgeable parents and grandparents and people around me who frankly gave me a better education than I was getting anyway. And there's a massive difference between what the most advantaged children are experiencing right now and what the most disadvantaged children. And I would want to say on that, Ciaran's talking about socially deprived children. And of course, there's a correlation there. I think it's really important we don't forget that there are quite a lot of well-to-do children who are ignored by their parents. Mm-hmm. And it's not an economic thing always. There's also quite an unusual swathe in the middle classes where internet usage is not as high as in the working classes. So it's not as straightforward. And then the final thing I'd say was age matters a lot. 7 weeks. If you are developing, maturing as a 5, 6, 7-year-old, 7 weeks of no intense cognitive demand on you is a really big deal.
Yeah.
If you're 15 and you have 7 weeks without that intense cognitive demand, you can recover from it.
Yeah.
But early years, those pupils in early years, missing 7 weeks of being forced to think is a problem.
Yeah.
So really diverse, really hard to sum up.
Yeah. Thomas, just finally over to you on that. If maybe you can clarify, is most of your focus of this academic year being CPD, and how is that? What sort of challenges have you seen there, or in general, what challenges have you seen in what you do?
Yes, I'm much more involved in training teachers and in particular training leaders. Mm-hmm. And what I've noticed about all this is, first of all, of course, Mark's point was those who are already organised, those who had systems in place, those who already embraced an element of online learning, of course, have taken off like a rocket. And I think what they've done is a good system they made even better. Yeah. Then there was the typical reactive situation where really leaders were left fogged and like the rabbit in the headlights, not quite know where to go. What's amazed me is that this has been a wonderful opportunity for schools to develop these sort of systems, not just in fact teaching maths, but in fact in any area of school development, and they haven't used it.
Yeah.
From my end of it, here's 7, 8, 9 weeks when they haven't got the distraction of pupils in the classroom every day of the week. They don't have to get supply cover in if they need to engage in a bit of training, a bit of development work. And actually what they've done is nothing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really quite serious, because the black hole that we've identified, or Mark identified just now, surely this is something which needs filling. And you'd have thought that they'd be gagging for some ideas and some training and some, to pick on Atul's brains, perhaps, who's been doing it for years. But nothing's come our way. It's been very much a matter of leaders literally flapping around, not moving forward. So that's really my experience, is that I don't think we've used the time. I'm thinking more big picture. I'm thinking more long term here. I'm thinking just this epidemic will it will finish at some point. Things will get back to some semblance of normality. And I would predict to probably say 25% or so of learning may well continue online for the foreseeable future. But I'm just anxious, really, that schools aren't developing anything. They're simply reacting.
But do you think, Thomas, that's changing to more strategic? And I'll explain why I ask it that way. We certainly saw, from a textile perspective at the very start, a clamor for that sort of quick fix, jump on a 1-hour webinar, see what formative assessment piece you can help me out with, but it wasn't necessarily strategic. We see a little bit more engagement with leaders now where they seem to be looking at the much longer term. And maybe that's because all of us collectively maybe saw this as just a short-term thing. We're going to finish out this academic year. We're going to solve the quick problems we have, but didn't have to look at it longer term. Do you think the tide's changing on that, or no?
I think my point is that the opportunity has been missed.
Okay.
We've had so much time when, frankly, we've not been able to do as much as we would like to do for our pupils because they're not there. Mm-hmm. And I think leaders have tried to jump in with both feet, and some of them are reporting, they're working 15, 16 hours a day and they're supervising this and that. And I think, well, actually, what are your teachers doing? Where's the delegation? School governors, for instance, normally they can only meet after school or at weekends. I bet they're available during the day, a lot of them, to work out some of these strategic ideas. So I just think there's a lack of a big picture moving forward on this. That it's caught us hopping. Let's be honest. It's caught us by an element of surprise, and all we've done is simply react to it. And I don't think we've benefited from it. And that's I think a sad thing. But going forward, I think what we have proved, and I've done a bit of maths coaching because there's people out there wanting to be coached in maths. I take up Ciaran's point, really. The online thing actually is great for sheer instruction, or indeed in teacher training hat on, it's great for lectures. In fact, it's better for lectures than sitting there in a room listening to somebody, because you've got your own space. You can turn yourself on and off. But I think what we lack is that pupil-to-pupil interaction, the ability to get a really good discussion going. It's all right for coaching, one-to-one, that's fine. Yeah, it works well. But I wonder if we can't really replace, I don't think, that sense of collaboration in the classroom.
Atul, Thomas referred to you there just in terms of your experience there. Have you seen a big rise in interest that can bring your experience to bear? I mean, you've been doing a lot of online work, and I think you've done a lot of that in conjunction with Mark and stuff as well on online broadcasts and sessions. So have you seen a big demand in people looking at, well, how do you do it from a tutor perspective, and can I translate that to classroom practice?
Yeah, I mean, I've been selling, in effect, online tutoring to anyone and everyone I can for quite a long time, actually, including parents, of course. And just to echo Mark's point, like you can have a lot of middle-class parents who are just scared of technology. It's one thing I keep hearing from parents. I'm not a tech person, there is that barrier as well. So, but I've pushed online tutoring so far that in 2016, in this one-on-one space anyway, I was just getting much better articulation from students, and using this kind of digital platform, whiteboard and video call, I could carefully structure what information I need to present to them, considering all that cognitive load theory, avoid the clutter. I can minimize my video screen. And so a lot of my colleagues call it, they don't call it face-to-face tutoring, but I call it, for me, it's completely face-to-face. It's actually, in some ways, it's even more face-to-face than face-to-face, because I'm actually seeing them head-on all the time. And I don't want to do that all the time. I want to decide when I want to see them and when I want to focus them on the whiteboards. But I can really carefully design this process, and then you can use all sorts of dynamic geometry software, etc., which they would they would use in a classroom, but they're already on screen. Their attention, the way in which you utilize their attention, which is all on screen, there's a pedagogy to it, and that takes time to learn. As for translating it into classroom, I mean, I obviously haven't done groups, so I couldn't speak for that. But just as a similar example, I trained up my dance instructors who do do group classes, and what they need to be able to see is all their students simultaneously, and because the feedback they give is based on posture, so it's visual and immediate. And they've just basically got a big TV screen with all 15 of us, and my instructor even says, I can keep an eye on every single one of you, which I couldn't do in a normal class, and give immediate corrections. And it's almost freaky how he just picks out people immediately and corrects them. So I think things can be pushed. It's just no one's ever had the need to do it as much. Yeah.
You mentioned there, Atul, which brings us well on to our next point. I suppose that there has to be a pedagogical shift, and actually you've got to come down to you, Mark, on this, because as anybody who knows you are a great advocate and indeed a leader in driving mastery with maths. And in terms of the approaches that you lay out within that and the commonly held approaches within mastery, how much of what is needed to achieve mastery is missing from this move to remote learning? I.e., if we look ahead and we say, look, our kids are only going to be in the classroom 2 out of 5 days a week, 3 out of 5 days a week, half time. How much of that lack of face-to-face time that Ciaran has talked about impacts that sort of pedagogical underlying approach that you lay out there?
The face-to-face time is interesting if you look at maths lessons, typical 1 hour maths lesson. Obviously, they vary from teacher to teacher, but if you do studies of this, about 7 or 8 minutes of instruction in a 1 hour lesson, thereabouts. And then the really good stuff, the stuff that makes the massive difference, which is stuff that Ciaran was talking about earlier, the in between the tables, the responsiveness, the talking, the tweaking, the adapting in the moment and so on, which is crucial in mastery. Correcting there and then in the moment is really important. Just like a really effective one-to-one tutor would do. And that's the hard thing to get right. Interestingly, mastery, which has been around a really long time, in the 50s, mastery was often referred to as personalized system of instruction. And it was meant to be a one-to-one thing, even though you've got a class, a one-to-one thing. And in the 50s, they theorized that the way in which you'd be able to really achieve a mastery approach is when the technology is sufficient to do it. Because then you can truly have a one-to-one responsive thing. And you see, there are such good examples of this now, Patrick. If you look at things been around a while, but look at Code Academy, for example. If you want to pick up and learn how to code, you haven't got a teacher, you've just got Code Academy, right? And how does it do it? How does it achieve the responsiveness that we're missing at the moment? Well, it's continually asking you to do things, then monitoring what you do and feeding back and changing the route you're taking through your learning and so on. And that kind of, people will often refer to this as kind of artificial intelligence technology for learning, artificial general intelligences, where an educator has set the map previously, so that the map knows where to take you, knows all of the connections in mathematics. The stuff that a maths teacher knows in their head, they know if I'm watching someone add 2 fractions together and what they keep doing is adding the denominators, I can spot that and I can do something about it there and then in the moment. And I know that because I've taught adding fractions thousands of times and I know how to react. That level of sophistication of technology doesn't really exist in maths education as yet, although there have been many grand claims that it does exist. It doesn't really exist, but it is heading that way. And then there's a really interesting thing about, okay, so if we have something that when children are engaging with tasks and engaging with questions and engaging with practice that can be reactive, that can do that in the moment, tweaking, changing things, moving the journey, what then is the teacher doing? And then maybe we could vastly enhance the teacher's models, metaphors, examples, instruction, the way in which the teacher communicates mathematics, the way in which they try to get children to grip novel ideas. Maybe we could also vastly improve or increase the amount of time that a teacher can spend with an individual pupil, doing those in the moment correctives, the big things. And it's an interesting thing that, okay, kids have been away from school for 7 weeks. does that mean kids have had less instruction? Well, not really. In fact, for many children, they've had significantly more instruction. Watching a 20-minute video or a 1-hour video of taught material, that's far more instruction than you would get in a 1-hour maths lesson, where it takes 10 minutes to get the lesson going, 15 minutes to do a starter, 5 minutes to clean up at the end. There's not a lot of instruction happens in that period. Whereas what I'm seeing at the moment is that lots of teachers have reacted thinking, my lessons are 1 hour, so I must make a 1-hour video or do a 1-hour webinar. That's a heck of a lot more instruction than they actually do in a normal lesson.
It's interesting you say that, Mark, because I have a nearly 16-year-old daughter studying GCSE maths. Very bright maths girl. I asked her, what is your biggest challenge with maths instruction? And she says, the teacher keeps sending me 50-minute videos every week. And so that actually, for firsthand, it's like that instruction time. And Ciaran, coming back to some of your points, like what have you had to do to shift that model? So, for example, when you look at new maths concepts that you haven't had the time to introduce, perhaps part of a course on a GCSE EAS A2 level course, or even a Key Stage 3, how have you approached that when we've had to take into consideration all that Mark said and Atul and Thomas has said about the change in the approach to the children? What have you done to help address that?
So, I mean, a typical lesson of mine now would include, firstly, myself using the technology that I have at home. And I'm quite lucky because my department in school were able to purchase for me tablets and things like that. And I'll go back to Thomas's point there, just about what schools, what have they been doing? They've been caught on the hop. The issue for me is that the funding hasn't been there in schools. The schools aren't able to react quickly to this type of change. Some schools are able to do it better than others. Some departments within schools are able to do it better than others. So I'm very lucky in terms of the department that I'm involved in with schools. So I have the technology here at home to create a lesson, and I would be using things like Notability, Explain Edu. Google Classroom would be my main platform at the moment that I would use. And typically I would be working on videos. I'm glad you said about the 50-minute thing, because none of my videos have been anywhere near that. My videos typically last 7 or 8 minutes. They're succinct, they're to the point, and they would be posted on Google Classroom. Now, with that would come an exercise, and this is the point I was making earlier. It's instruction. It's allowing the children then to go and do an exercise. I have to some extent then been able to help children with individual problems, but it's been a lot slower than what it would normally be in the classroom. So they would then go away, do the work, and they are able to then take pictures of their work and submit it to me. I'm then able to, put down little annotation, corrections, and even voice memos and get back to them. So the process of helping the kids understand where they've gone wrong with a particular issue is still happening. It's just not happening as quickly as we do in the classroom. So that's all been good, but it relies heavily on technology. And I'm in a good position because, like Atul, I've been using technology for years. So I'm able to make that seamless transition. I know that many of my colleagues haven't been able to do that. And this is where there's been different levels of things going on across subjects.
Probably one bridge there, or one divide there, Ciaran. But actually, I'm gonna pop back into something Mark said and ask your experience of it, Ciaran. Mark, you mentioned that some of this technology that can actually be harnessed in terms of AI and can start to pick up patterns and start to prompt and perhaps give extension activities based around practice. Those aren't quite there yet, though. So are we still at that? Are we still stuck in we're using Google Classroom and we've got to figure out how we do simple things like assessment or one-to-one tutoring, or like where are we? Have we got a gap between what you're talking about there, Mark, and Ciaran, what maybe you're talking about is the reality of practice there? Have we still got some time to go before we can get to that Maths utopia? To both of you, to Ciaran or to Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, and I think Thomas will probably be more aware of this in terms of what I've just said. Teachers need trained in how to use this. I mean, this is probably one thing we will speak about. But CPD needs to change to. I mean, if this is going to be something that we're going to be using a lot in the future. CPD of teachers needs to reflect that. And of course, the challenge is how is that going to be implemented as well under the current restrictions and so on. Because the level of education of how we use technology to teach among teachers is, it's so variable, and it's going to be really difficult in such a short period of time to actually nail that and challenge that and allow teachers to move forward.
The challenge, and I'll put this to Thomas, the challenge for CPD in that, and I've always seen it through my career, is that there tends to be two silos of CPD. There tends to be the pedagogical silo, or there tends to be the technology silo, and there's never been, in my experience, a really good quality crossover that suggests that technology is there to underpin sort of the good practice and the pedagogical approaches. It tends to be a them or us thing. Thomas, how do we get over situations like that where everybody rushes to get technology trained and forgets about the heart of the pedagogy and the teaching practice that they have to put in place?
I think you're absolutely right, Patrick. The big divide is completely unhelpful. And I think part of the problem is in education generally, we get certain targets set to us. I mean, when I was an Ofsted inspector, for example, technology in the curriculum was something we looked at. But a lot of schools imagine that if they tick a couple of boxes, they have a couple of interactive whiteboards, and some of the teachers use them some of the time. Well, that's okay, guys, we've ticked that off. And I think what this pandemic has really showed us is that the technology and the pedagogy should go absolutely hand in glove. They're not completely separate. Not completely separate things, and just to tick a box to keep Ofsted off your back is not the way forward in education. So yes, what we now need is for the two sides to get together. And the glorious thing about this pandemic, and I'm sorry I keep looking for all the silver linings and finding some, is that teachers now understand why it's important. You see, up until now, the people who were really tech savvy and really happy with it, they ran away with it and they did some great things. And those who are a little bit more Luddite, basically scrape by with the bare minimum and let the other guys get on with it. And suddenly they've all woken up to the fact that, hey, there's something really quite useful about all this. And so that's a big springboard now for us to move forward on this CPD. And you're quite right, get the technological people to underpin the pedagogy, and get the pedagogy people to say, this is the technology we need. Because my first action is, if I was still a school leader, my first thing I'd do when I got back in September or whenever it is you start, I'd be saying to the teachers, right, what went really well and what went really badly, and how are we going to put all of that right? What have you found? For example, when I've been teaching my maths online, I find it really hard to share equations with equations I'm doing further maths A level, so it's, I want to use a lot of integrals and sigma signs and limits and infinity signs and all this sort of stuff, and I can't do it. I tried even sort of writing on a bit of paper and holding up to the camera, but it turns it laterally inverts it so you can't read it. So, and I'm going to write backwards all the time. So you see little things like that, these little frustrations. I'm sure somebody can sort that out. It's not beyond the realms of possibility. One thing that did occur to me just listening to the others talking earlier on is, can we take a bit of a leaf out of language teachers' books? I'm doing an online Italian course, for example, and the way it works is you type in your answers and you speak your answers and so on and so forth. And if you get a few right, it sets you a few harder ones to tackle, and a bit more grammar comes in. If you think you get a few things wrong, it goes back and repeats them again and gives you some simple examples. So it's a highly intelligent platform. And in a way, we could do this with maths. Surely we could set some work online, and as the students work through it on their own, they can pick up, and as they get progressively lots of questions right, they become more and more challenging if they get struggling, and that would actually give the teacher an idea of when to intervene. Let's get the tech guys to really explain to the pedagogies how we can really make this work. You see, we should be using this as an extension to what we do already. This isn't something to replace the class teaching. This is an extension. This is something extra. This is as good an invention as the quill pen would have been to a monk.
It's an enabler. Yeah. I mean, I was very fortunate. I've spoke at a few of the maths conferences, Mark, as you know, and the very first one actually I spoke at was actually the first time I met you, Atul, as well, a few years ago now, and I can't even remember what city we were in at that. That's traveling that much. And one of the interesting things, as somebody coming from I suppose a technology company, that technology background, is that the very first thing I did was I asked at the start of the session about the technology was used in the maths classroom. Now, as usual at maths conferences, they're always buzzing. They're wonderful events if you've never been to them. They have some fantastic educators there. The room was full of people. They were all keen to listen to what I had to say. And I said, right, tell me what technology you use and let's put it on a word cloud. And the thing that took me back at that time, and I should have known it, but the problem of a technologist working always in technology circles is that you don't always see both sides of it, was that there were only really about there were only three words that come up on the word cloud. The largest word that came up on the word cloud was interactive whiteboard or whiteboard. And the second largest word was scientific calculator. And the third one, very, very, very way down, was an iPad down the list. So what was interesting to me was that I had quite obviously a bunch of practitioners in a room, incredibly keen to learn, incredibly passionate about maths, but yet the technology integration within that flow, is that down to a lack of understanding, gents, or is that down to the technology, as you said, Thomas, just hasn't been there? I mean, Ciaran, you're using some tools, Atul, you're using some tools. Have we just not got it right to give maths teachers the right tools that they need to underpin their approaches to learning?
Can we turn this the other way around? I mean, the students of today are far more tech savvy than most of their teachers.
Yeah.
And it seems to me we got nowadays, you could look at your smartphone. I mean, it's an incredible gadget. All the things that it can do, you know, and what we do in schools, we ban them. So, I mean, to me, the technology almost should start bottom up. The technology the students are using day by, and I know we criticize them for it, and I appreciate that. And as a head, one of my curses was you know, text message bullying and all the rest of it. But it's a marvelous, fantastic piece of kit that the children really understand and really get to grips with and really engage with. So why aren't we building this bottom up? Why aren't we asking the students about how would they see their mobile devices being used to help them? They've woken up. You see, this is the other aspect about this pandemic is students have woken up to the fact that they need teachers after all. and also woken our parents up.
I agree with you there, Thomas, 100%. I mean, actually in my classroom, mobile phones aren't banned, and I encourage their use, but the big thing is there has to be trust. And I spend the first few days creating the ground rules and the boundaries, because they could be doing other things, like, you know, but I think if there's that trust there and there's that consistency there, and I think this needs to come down from the very top, from the policymakers. How do we integrate mobile devices into schools, and how do we do it safely? How do we keep pupils safe, and how do we keep teachers safe? And it comes down to strong classroom management, but there has to be a set of boundaries coming down from the very top, the policymakers, as to what's acceptable and what's not, and what are the consequences of pupils, for example, not using the devices properly. But I think it's an amazingly strong tool, and the children in my classes are exceptional at using them, and it's a great. I couldn't teach now without that tool, because all of my material is now online, and I have that interface there with the pupils all the time. So it's a great tool. Can I just come in and just say as well, just while I'm speaking, I've seen some exceptional pieces of work from our older pupils, and the key words here for me are independent study. We have been trying for years, from our fifth years and sixth years, to get them to prepare them for life beyond school. How do we get these kids to do more than they're expected to do, to learn by themselves, to produce exceptional pieces of work by themselves? And I have received some amazing pieces of work from my older pupils, demonstrating that, you know what, if we do let them off the leash a little, if we're not over their backs all the time in the classroom, then actually they can go away and do, you know, create some amazing pieces of work. So that for me has been great as well.
Do you think, Ciaran, does this potential blended learning piece? I think the DFE are using blended learning in a completely incorrect way. I mean, this is not how we all designed blended learning. It was never meant to be like this, but let's call it blended stroke remote learning going forward. But do you think that allows those students who perhaps would have ran faster and would have ran harder with maths the freedom to do it now that they have a more flexible working environment and they have access to tools? Is everybody seeing that? Do you see that, Ciaran?
I'm seeing that with my top pupils.
Okay.
And I've comments, sir, can you give me more work? I'm bored.
Yeah.
That's the honest truth. And, so I've had to react to that and certainly, sort of try and push and challenge those pupils.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the high flyers are maybe not being stimulated enough at home, but they are asking for more work, which is great to see, because you probably wouldn't see that if you were in school. On a day-to-day basis. They might be embarrassed to have that sort of extra work and things. So I think
I was just going to say there, and this is to all of you really, but interesting to pick up on something Thomas said in terms of students using technology. And my view on this has always been that yes, but incorrectly, a lot of people refer to our children as digital natives. They all know what they're doing, but in actual fact, when it comes to learning, the practitioners of the world, are the experts in learning, and trying to get our students to understand how to use the tools as a learning tool is perhaps a bit of a challenge there. But my question to the panel is in and around engagement. So for a long time, we've heard maths practitioners like yourselves be so energetic and so excited about maths. And how do we get our students to be as excited as maths as the practitioners in the room? Does technology help with that in general terms? Does remote learning and the increased use of technology help with engagement, do you think? Mark, over to you on that one.
Well, it certainly can do if designed well. Though I would just caution that engagement is not a good proxy for learning. Yeah. It's very easy to be very busy and learn nothing at all. Yeah. But if you look at the games industry and the way in which they make getting from level to level to level just perfectly difficult. No child is interested in doing something that's easy, and no child's interested in doing something that's so ridiculously hard they can never be successful. And motivation, quite often in education we get it the wrong way around and say, how can we motivate children to be successful? It's just not how it works. Children are motivated when they are successful. It's the other way around. So we need to create moments of success, moments of a child thinking, wow, I get that. Wow, I didn't think I could get that. That was really hard, but now I get that. And that's where motivation comes from. So keep dropping in these little moments of success. The games industry, the digital games industry, have been doing this for decades and decades with huge success. No one wants to play a game that's easy to win. It's got to be perfectly hard enough. That could be used to do that. Children are not very good. We know research is replicable. We've done many times. Children are not good at choosing conditions for learning. They might well choose conditions that make them feel happy and feel good. That's not the same thing as conditions that are good for learning. Learning is biologically difficult. It's a difficult thing. It's supposed to be difficult. If you learn every single thing you ever encountered, you'd go insane, right? So you're supposed to have to give great attention, great thought to things if you want them to eventually be embedded in your schema of knowledge and your long-term memory. These are tricky things to do. And given the option, children and teachers and adults choose pretty poor conditions for learning. I mean, we either believe that an expert teacher who has spent decades becoming great at their art has a profound impact on children, or we don't. And I do believe that expert teachers have a profound impact on children, and I believe that they are super important. The technology, of course, can supplement that and can take away lots of burden, give them quicker data, easier things to react to. The mobile phone thing, some schools ban them, some schools allow them. I would say we should proceed with caution. If you look at the work of Jean Twenge, for example, who's probably the most authoritative voice in this domain, and look at what has happening cognitively with children, particularly from 2005 onwards. We're carrying out a social experiment on millions and millions of children, and we don't yet know where that leads. We don't yet know that the lack of self-regulation will not have a detrimental impact. It certainly seems to be having a detrimental impact if you look at graduates from 2015 onwards. So I think we need to be really very, very careful about that. 12, 13 years below, no child of mine would have a smartphone. And also, if we want to learn, we know a heck of a lot about learning, a heck of a lot. And it is biological, it is chemical. You are literally making connections across neural networks, in a very literal, physical sense. Those biological processes, those chemical processes, the only way in which we are aware of making those happen is by children giving very serious, detailed attention to. Now, if you can just look something up on a phone, you're not giving serious, detailed attention to. And if I look at now the number of 16-year-olds who are abysmal at questioning whether a statistic is true or not, who simply believe everything in the newspaper, who, when given an equation and they put it into a piece of technology, will argue till they're blue in the face that they must be right because the screen says so, regardless of whether they've given it any thought about whether the answer makes sense or not. So that debate around computer-based learning or computer-assisted learning, I think that's a really important debate. I would use technology to assist my learning all the time, right? In the same way I'll use a jack to get my car up. I'm not going to try and do it.
Sure.
But computer-based learning, where I'm simply asking the machine and then trusting the machine's response over my own cognitive process, I'd be very cautious about doing that.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to move on slightly, and there's a word mentioned earlier. Maybe it was by you, Mark, perhaps by Atul, and I just want to bring everybody in on this. As we go forward and we look at this blended approach, maybe it's, as I've said before, maybe it's 3 days in, 2 days out, maybe it's half day every day, but we know we're going to have reduced instruction time for at least the next academic year. That's quite likely. So the actual face time is reduced, and Mark, I know you've already elaborated on how that's not perhaps as critical to the overall structure. So totally get that. What does it start to look like in terms of the change in modeling? If you only have your Atul, if you had your tutees for half the time, Ciaran, if you had your classes for half the time as you would have had them last academic year, what does the structure look like in your classroom? Does it look like when they're outside classroom, it's drill and practice? What does that look like? Very general terms.
Yeah, I mean, I do one-on-one work, but if I had sort of few hours, which has happened with a few keys, then it entirely depends on the tutee actually, and there's such a huge difference between teaching a 7-year-old online to teaching an A-level student 18-year-old online that just developmentally it's a totally different ball game. And with someone who's 7, 8 and needs the right starting point, needs a lot of work, the parents' input is absolutely vital. So I'll often train the parents up, and I'll say, actually, you have to sit in for part of this lesson or whole of this lesson, so that you do so and so and so with this child, and what you do between this week and the next week is just as important, if not more important, with this child. And if they're doing A levels, etc., so they're nearly adults, so they are motivated enough if they want to go to the university to get that maths A level, to go into the engineering or architecture, etc., that I then kind of back off a little bit and I say, here's a bunch of questions. I've just shown you how to do this. This is a teach to phase. I'd like you to do them and then self-mark and tell me what you get stuck at. So it moves more towards asynchronous, but the meat of it is really in that synchronous live interaction. It's batting to and fro between student and teacher.
But then you're looking at, so if you take, Ciaran, for example, in your case, and I don't know this to be a fact, but am I right in saying you haven't done any synchronous teach, so any live lessons through Zoom or anything like that? That's not something that your school is taking on board?
I mean, the thing is that there's bigger issues than that. For example, safeguarding. I mean, we have been getting conflicting advice about do we phone pupils, do we go one-on-one videos, do we even do class videos? because we're not sure how safe that is, for teachers and for pupils alike. So we have been advised by unions and so on at the minute not to engage in that, because we simply don't know what it looks like. So I think it would be really useful. But as I said before, I think more needs to be done by the Department of Education, the policymakers, to say, how is this going to be done and how is this going to be done safely? I think, and Mark, I think, mentioned it there about caution. I think so many things. For example, this video could be taken away and somebody could augment it however they wish, and you could be represented and so on. And the same thing can happen in these online classrooms. I think teachers and pupils alike both need to feel safe. But going forward, Paddy, I mean, that technology development that way needs to happen. There's 4 things for me that need to happen. And this needs to come under an umbrella, somebody in charge of all this. Technology development. The teacher training. As Atul, you mentioned that their parents need educated and pupils need educated as to what's expected of them moving forward with all this technology. And this all has to happen in consultation with the people that make the decisions and write the policies and so on.
Yeah. But what is, Ciaran, on a more basic level there, what your 3-day, 2-day split, sake of argument, that's what it looks like. Those 2 days when your students are at home, does that look like a repetitive practice model? Does that look like working through online assignments? What are they doing outside a classroom in this kind of, I was trying to get away from the term new normal the entire hour, but I'm going to have to say it, the new normal, whatever that looks like next year. What does that look like, literally, practically?
I mean, for me, the classroom time, say it is 50-50, whatever way it's going to work, will be invaluable in, disseminating the information, but using that time to iron out any little creases and get individual one-to-one time with each pupil. Yeah. For me, I think it's not necessarily a bad thing that they go away and they're at home for those next few days. For me, that's a chance for them to use it for independent study. And that's certainly the term that I would use. Show us what you can do. But for that to be effective, you need to have a differentiation in terms of the material you send home with these kids. There needs to be material there that's going to extend the better pupils, but material there that's not going to lose the less able pupils. So it's that argument that a few of the panel members said earlier on. I think it was Mark. You need to balance that right. Keep them interested, but also have that extension there. Yeah. But when they're at home as well, we're still need to go to, we need to be in contact with them also for anything else that needs to pop up. I think it's a model that can be successful, but it needs to be well thought out and well planned, and everybody in terms of educators needs to be on the same page as to how that's going to happen.
So thanks, Ciaran. So just linking in then with Thomas. Thomas, your view on CPD going forward, and what do we need to change about CPD? What do we need to harness? What do we need to do differently? Do we need to be more strategic? What does CPD start to look like as we move into next year, from your perspective?
Right, I think what we've learned is that, and it links in actually with what you've all been saying about maths teaching, actually, because in a way CPD is about training, it's about teaching. First of all, the online remote bit, actually the lecturing instruction side of it works really well. And so you don't need to travel hundreds of miles to London or Liverpool or somewhere to get some of that, because in fact you can get it succinctly in your front room. So I can't help but think that some of the shift may well embrace technology in that sort of way. On the other hand, there's absolutely no substitute, just as in the classroom, there's no substitute for that face-to-face, the human interaction, the picking up on ideas as we go along, just as you would all do. It's no different from a lesson in that sense. And also there's something else which I think we've not talked about in a mathematical context, and that's inspiration and enthusiasm. And one of the reasons why some of our youngsters go off and study maths, which after all is the greatest subject in the curriculum, is because teachers are enthusiastic about it. And when I'm training school leaders, I need to be really enthusiastic about leadership, not how hard and long the days are, but how rewarding the days are. So the face-to-face is still really, really important, but we can now, I think, streamline our CPD, make it, because it's not value for money at the moment, frankly. It just isn't value for money. You're paying £300 for a day's course. You're paying another £200 on train fares and airfares and goodness knows what. You're paying another £200 on a supply teacher. You're honestly telling me that's cost effective. So yeah, I think we can use this pandemic. What bits have worked really well as to streamline it, and then still bring in the face-to-face, but on a reduced basis. With this emphasis, as I think I already said, on linking in technology and pedagogy together. One's not a substitute for the other, absolutely not. The teacher is, and I agree with Mark on this one, the teacher is absolutely paramount. Yeah. You know, we're not making ourselves redundant out of this. We're absolutely vital, but the technology is an extra prop to help support us. And as I said, I don't think we've been joined up on that, and that's really where we need to start getting some ideas.
Just picking up on some points there. Is there a danger at this point that, and I'm not saying that this first part is a bad thing, but obviously CPD has been focused at practitioner level, and I know all of you on the call are involved in leadership training as well. But do we need to ensure that CPD level is not simply parked with a head of department and his or her associated staff members? Do we need to ensure that leadership are getting the correct professional development going forward as to how this strategic fit of technology, pedagogy, and this shift in remote learning fits? Are we doing that? Do we need to be doing that? Or do we run into a danger where leadership does, as I think Ciaran, you alluded to earlier, leadership kind of steps back from this and says, well, that's a practical classroom focus and I don't need to be involved in it. Is that something we need to be aware of?
I can't see how you could possibly be a school leader if you don't lead the curriculum. You know, and the curriculum means also what goes on in the curriculum, the teaching. I mean, the leader doesn't have to be the best teacher in the school, but he or she, and certainly they shouldn't be the worst teacher in the school, but he or she really needs to have an understanding of what is actually going on and what we need to move forward. Otherwise, you end up with this sort of black hole almost between the leadership and their sort of highfalutin ideas, if you like, and the practitioners who are frankly now, some of them are really, really, really struggling because this is something which is unprecedented. And as I say, in a way, but I think one of the things the leaders need to be doing is joining a discussion like this. Where they can think to themselves, well, actually, there's some strategic stuff in this. It's not just about a bunch of maths teachers talking to each other.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of strategic stuff, so let's move on slightly. One of the things that I've been paying some close attention to, as I'm sure we all have, is particularly in England, the Department for Education, and lots of guideline pieces that have come out. And I suppose I've struggled with the guideline, and any guidelines for effective teaching and learning has been in and around specifics of assessment or motivation of engagement, all of which are absolutely important. But what are the wider policy changes we should be talking to DFE about and government at that level? Are we focusing on the fact that we need equity of access? We need devices out there. Do we need infrastructure for schools? Do we need improved CPD? What should we, if we had a platform with DFE tomorrow, what one thing would you tell them to do? I'll go with Mark on that. And Mark laughed when I said one, because he probably has about 21, as I'm sure you all have. But what one piece of policy would you like to put in place there, specifically with regards to maths and remote learning?
One's no good, Patrick.
Okay, I'll give you two today, Mark. I'll give you two.
Well, you know, we used to have until the mid-2000s, we had a pandemic plan with a national virtual school. That used to exist, and that could come online if the whole school system shut down. Probably should start that up again. That might help. This whole thing, for decades now, this whole thing is going in one direction, and there's no stopping it. It is going to go in one direction. The solution to this is going to come along. The market forces will create a solution to this if needs be. But it would be good if government could at least encourage the joining up of technology companies and educators and try to come up with solutions that are actually based on education. The maths technology market is saturated with products. They're nearly all garbage because they're nearly all designed by people who have no idea what learning is or what a classroom feels like and so on. So I think the joining up of those could work really well. And maybe the other thing, and government can do this because it can do it through R&D tax credits, it can do it through things like smart grants and getting Innovate to intervene. They could also drive a set of behaviors where solutions that are going to be implemented at national scale must not rely on parental dispositions. Because one of the problems here is that we are talking about solutions where, Atul said earlier on, it's really important that parents are trained up in this. Ciaran's talked about the independent learning dispositions that a child has. A lot of that will have come from parents being forced to sit down and work for an hour. If we only create solutions that rely on the dispositions that a child's parents have, then we just widen and widen and widen the gap between the most advantaged and the most disadvantaged. And technology is really advanced now. It really is. There are artificial general intelligences out there doing very interesting things in other domains, in pharmaceuticals and automation, but not in education. And we could create, through tax relief and other incentives, we could create technologies that pupils can use alongside their teachers that are not reliant on their home conditions. Hardware's almost saturated. Nearly everyone has hardware. Hardware is not the issue, and broadband is not the issue. But a quiet room to sit in, that's an issue. That's a really big issue. A parent who will let you occupy a table for 5 hours, that's a really big issue. So we need to come up with solutions that get around those sorts of things. And then because you do join them up, so this is still one thing, right, Patrick? I'm still saying,
it's still one thing.
I'm basically saying join educators and technologists. Then the other part of that is if you do that, if you have a policy that incentivizes the joining of educators and technologists, what the commercial technology providers would start to realize is that teachers, through lots and lots of training and thousands of hours in classrooms, have a set of very honed superpowers. Teachers are amazing individuals, face to face. They have their entire existence is about human relationships and interactions and body language and communication. And what's happened 6, 7, 8 weeks ago is that the entire profession suddenly had all its superpowers taken away from it. And there is a huge swathe of the profession who at the moment feel terribly guilty because they are not as impactful as they once were. And I think we need to say to teachers, nor should you be, because actually what we've just suddenly asked you to do also takes honing and training and careful development. And in the UK last year, for every £1 spent on hardware or software, 4 pence was spent on the professional development to learn that hardware or software. That's the problem.
Startling statistic, yeah.
So I think that's one thing.
That's one thing, yeah. 47 minutes later, that was one thing. Should have known what I was getting myself into. Ciaran, if you had one thing, you talked earlier about sort of being dropped in at the deep end almost of having to switch to this overnight and needing leadership to drive forward. What would be your advice to the Department for Education in terms of one thing as a practitioner you'd just like to see sorted out for the new academic year? What one piece of advice would you give them?
Well, I don't know whether it would be a piece of advice, but one concern moving forward and something that I've been involved in over the past 5 weeks has been how do at the end of this you're coming out with a set of qualifications. How do we give grades to pupils? What's going to happen in the next academic year with regards to GCSEs and A levels? Because teachers have stressed and put an enormous amount of work into trying to give pupils grades that match what they've done the past academic year, and the instructions of how we do that or did that as teachers were changing on a daily basis. So what we would like to see as teachers is how is that going to look next year? How are we going to prepare for that? Because at the end of the day, children who are setting GCSEs and A levels are doing it to get a grade to do something else in life. So we need to make sure there's a robust a set of processes in place that we're aware of before we start teaching in August or September as to how these children are going to be graded at the end of the day.
Okay, Atul, from your perspective, and I know you can absolutely come at it from a tutor perspective, but is there one piece of advice, is one piece of policy you could influence? What would it be in the current environment from an education perspective?
I mean, I would probably sum it up as digital literacy for adults. I know that the children under the correct tutor who knows what they're doing online really take to this like phenomenally well. But it's the adults, it's the parents, it's the other tutors, it's the teachers. Even simple things like you have to restart your router if there's a problem, or these just very IT skills, how to manipulate Windows, how to interact with a computer. There's just a huge population of adults that don't, they have really good hardware, actually the latest iPhone, but you can do loads of things on these things. So just a commitment to adult digital literacy, I would say.
Okay, to help support the home environment as well there. And Thomas, over to you. I think you can have two as well. Mark got his two in there clearly. Feel free.
First and foremost, invest and respect teachers. Now you go, well, I would say that, wouldn't I? Because I'm involved in CPD. But seriously, doctors just mend people. Teachers make them. And I think it's high time the DFE woke up to the fact that they really do need to invest in this cracking profession. And that means investing in CPD. That means investing in their self-respect and self-esteem. And indeed, I think, again, the general public has come to respect teachers rather more of late, because they've suddenly seen what they actually get up to in the classroom. Now that the parents have had to do the job for themselves. So yeah, it's that sense of investment and respect, and that ties in with what we've been talking about today. Because as I say, we need to link in, and I agree with Mark, bring in the tech companies into that, make it a whole integrated approach. And I suppose the second thing I would say is that move away from judging teachers and judging schools based on data, and move towards judging schools and judging teachers on what they actually do in the classroom, how they actually perform, which comes back to that investment that I talked about earlier on. So a complete, I suppose I wouldn't be allowed to do this, but if I could scrap Ofsted tomorrow and rebuild a system that teachers had respect for, and as I say, wasn't simply data driven, but was much more about what we are all about, which is the teachers.
Yeah, I always get concerned about that term, data driven, and certainly in that context, data can be a dirty word. But I think coming from a technology standpoint, and going back to something Mark said earlier, and Ciaran as well, we can use data, which is not that data, I entirely get, but the two can be confused very often. We can use data really well to inform practice as we go and as we measure progression. Yeah. Given, guys, that I do feel we have a really, really, really good panel here today, I wonder if you'll indulge me in one question, which is, before we start to wrap up today, I just want to ask you a question, and there's only one answer on this. So maths exams, end of year maths exams, do we scrap them, keep them as is, or move them digitally? And that's the only three choices you've got. Do we scrap end of year exams? Do we move them to digital equivalents as they are now? Or do we keep them as is? So, Ciaran, you don't have to justify your answer. You just have to give me a quick answer.
Keep them.
As is?
Keep as is, but we're going to need to figure out how that works.
Well, on pen and paper. Okay. Atul?
I stopped teaching with using pen and paper about 4 years ago, so everything's digital for me.
So, the same exams, move them online. Mark?
I don't really see much need for terminal exams if you're in a mastery approach, because you're assessing continuously.
Okay. And Thomas?
Sorry, could I just clarify, is this GCSE and A-level, or is this simply...
let's consider formal exams,
I'm going to agree with Ciaran, keep as is.
Okay, all right. That's a very, very much a split jury there, okay. And I, as chair, I don't even have a cast and vote in this whatsoever, so I'll just have to move on. I'm the impartial arbiter in the middle. So, gents, as we round off today, I've really only got one final point to raise, and this will be a very short one, and it's just in terms of giving advice to maths teachers going forward. So literally, belt and braces, teaching in the classroom, moving forward to what we really don't know things are going to look like next year. Is it blended? Is it part-time? Is it phased? Are we getting only 4 months out of 6 months? We don't know what it's going to look like. Thomas, what's your advice in terms of maths teaching going forward? What one piece of advice could we do and put in place that supports maths teachers for the coming academic year?
I think we've really got to be streamlined. I think we've got to be really, really efficient. That whichever way it pans out, whatever happens, and we as you say, we don't know how that balance is going to look. Yeah. I just think every single word, every single action that we take, whether it be online or face-to-face in the classroom, I think it's really got to matter. And I do think that we can be inefficient sometimes as teachers. I think we can repeat ourselves a great deal. I think we sometimes do set children meaningless, boring tasks. We set homework because we're told we have to rather than because we need to. And I think that's got to change. I think we need to be really, really focused, really efficient and effective. They're not the same thing.
Good advice. Ciaran?
My word here would be communication. Learn in the current situation how best to communicate with your pupils and do what works for you and them, because there's so many different technologies out there. Use the one that you're most comfortable with. But that for me is key, being able to communicate and provide feedback to your pupils moving forward.
Thanks, Ciaran. Atul?
This is more to relay my tutor colleagues, which is just to get out there and take some CPD. Actually, I think you learn more from meeting other teachers and the wider maths community by going out there for CPD and meeting them than you will on your own for like many years. Yeah.
And Mark, I don't know how I end up giving you the last word, but you have the last word in this. I'm just going to put it down to the way the screen looks. Mark, one piece of advice you could give to teachers preparing for next year.
I would say spend time improving your own subject-specific pedagogical knowledge. There is nothing more important. Actually, if we'd have closed all the schools down for the last 7 weeks and did no online teaching or distance learning and let the kids be kids for a bit, whilst all teachers dedicated themselves to becoming mathematics specialists and improving their own knowledge of models, metaphors, examples, ways of communicating mathematical ideas, we probably would have had a more profound impact for those who teach children above the age of 8. Because, as I said earlier, you can't have that size of a gap for early year children.
Yeah. Brilliant advice. Well, that brings us to the end of the broadcast today, and I hope everybody watching has found it incredibly insightful. I said at the outset, I was here to listen and to learn. I probably talked more than I expected to, but I definitely did have an incredible insight into the views of our panelists. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank each of our panelists for their very valuable time today. I really do appreciate you joining us. So to Ciaran, thank you. Atul, thank you. Thomas and Mark, really appreciate your insight. Value every piece of advice and word that you gave there. And we hope that we'll see you again sometime soon on another Text Help broadcast. So thank you and enjoy what is the remainder of the academic year and hopefully the start of a long and enjoyable summer for everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.